Can kale and Swiss chard be fermented? Yes, they can. I'm going to share with you my fermentation recipe for these super greens, as well as how to overcome some of the fermenting challenges that accompany them. These are the top 3 challenges I have found with fermenting kale and Swiss chard. Challenge number 1, the type of kale used. Unlike the tender leaves of spinach or lettuce, the structural integrity of kale leaves are thicker and tougher. They have firm, fibrous veins going through the leaves. Because of the structural integrity, it allows kale and Swiss chard to ferment better than soft greens like spinach and lettuce that will turn into mush. Some types of kale have more fibrous veins than others, which can make a difference in the pleasurable eating experience post-fermentation. Here's my tip to help with this. I have found broadleaf kale varieties like the type of kale I grow in my garden, which is called Siberian kale, to be a better choice than dinosaur kale. Dinosaur kale is so veinous that even after fermenting, it's like chewing on a wad of stringy fiber. Curly kale is not as bad as dino kale, but not as good as a really nice broadleaf because those curly edges are quite tough. So if you choose to move forward with fermenting kale, select a broadleaf variety for better results. If this simply isn't an option, you can try chopping up the dino or the curly kale into very small pieces to break up those fibrous veins as much as possible. As for Swiss chard, the good news is with this leafy green is that the leaves are less thick and tough as kale. Although Swiss chard also has fibrous veins through the leaf, they're not as numerous nor as tough as kale. So any variety of Swiss chard will be just fine to use. Challenge number 2, the fermentability of kale and Swiss chard. I have found with my own kale and Swiss chard fermentations that they need help for the fermentation to take hold. Due to the power washing of grocery store and or bagged kale / Swiss chard, you're looking at a near guarantee that the fermentation will fail because the needed beneficial microbes naturally present on the leaves, which are required for fermentation to take place, have been washed away. Even my own pristine, unwashed garden kale and Swiss chard struggle to ferment without doing this. Combine the kale or Swiss chard with other vegetables. Not only will the other vegetables help with flavor, but they will provide more food for the beneficial bacteria to be able to speedily and properly ferment. Plus, as an added bonus, the other vegetables will bring their own probiotic bacteria to the mix, which will enhance the probiotic profile of the fermentation. A fermentation that contains lots of different species of probiotics is a good thing. However, this tip only works with garden or farmer market kale and Swiss chard, providing that the market farmers didn't wash them. So, sorry for the bad news if store-bought is your only option. Later in this video, I will show you what happens when trying to ferment store-bought kale so that you can see the proof with your own eyes. Challenge number 3. The quantity needed. It takes a lot of kale or Swiss chard to fill just 1 quart or liter-sized jar because, kind of like with cooking them, you can start off with a bunch of large leaves filling the pot, only to have them dwindle into a couple bites worth after steaming. Kale and Swiss chard will have a similar dwindling effect once they come in contact with the saltwater brine. If you're relying on buying kale or Swiss chard bundles from a farmer's market, you'll more or less need at least 3 to 4 bundles depending on the bundle size. This can be a budget breaker and make that jar of fermented greens quite expensive. The solutions I have for this are 1, either grow your own or find a friend or family member who does, or 2, add more of the other vegetables to compensate for the lesser quantity of greens. This will make more sense when I give the recipe demonstration coming up. Once I demonstrate the recipe, afterwards I'll take you through the entire fermentation process so you know what to expect from day 1 all the way through the entire fermentation period. You'll learn how to tell if the fermentation is safe or not, plus how to store it long term, so stay tuned. I provide a link in the description to the written recipe that will have all the measurements given in both metric and American imperial. Chapters are also provided for this video in case you need to return in the future for reference on a particular segment. The ingredients needed are a broadleaf kale or any variety of Swiss chard. I'll be demonstrating predominantly with kale, but you will follow the same methods and measurements for Swiss chard. At least a couple of these vegetables: cabbage, onion, garlic cloves, or carrot. You can use just 2 of these in any combination or all of them. Spices, such as fennel seed, caraway seed, or dill seed. Pick the one that is your personal favorite. Lastly, you'll need salt and water. Do not use a salt that has anti-caking agents added because these chemicals can cause a fermentation to fail. Read the ingredient label to know whether or not your salt contains them. The best salt to use is one whose ingredients say salt and only salt. I'm going to head out to my garden now and pick some fresh kale and Swiss chard. Then we're going to head inside to make this healthy, probiotic-rich, fermented, super green fermentation recipe. First, inspect the leaves for dirt and possible critters. These little green worms are often found on the kale leaves in my garden. Place under the water the affected parts that need a light rinsing. Keyword, light. Absolutely no produce washes, baking soda, or vinegar soaks. Lay the leaf face down and cut out the stem. I know that there are some of you out there who love the stem, but I truly don't recommend them in a fermentation because they're so fibrous. Instead, save the stems to make a vegetable soup stock or add them to a juice or smoothie. Now, stack the leaves and roll them up like this. Slice the roll. I have found this method to allow for easy slicing. Since we want the kale and Swiss chard to soften during fermentation, thin slices are better than wide. Then cross-slice the leaves again. If using dino or curly kale, you'll want to chop them up even more than this. For Swiss chard, do everything exactly the same. Remove the stem, roll, slice, and slice again. You'll want about 7 to 8 cups of loose chopped kale or chard leaf. If you're short on the kale or Swiss chard, compensate by adding more of the upcoming vegetables. Add to a large mixing bowl. Peel and slice half of a large onion. Add to the bowl. After the onion, peel and slice 2 to 3 garlic cloves, then add to the bowl. If you're going to add cabbage like I am, then there's no need to wash or rinse it since we're removing the outer leaves anyway. With this next layer of leaves, pull off a couple and set aside. Try to keep them intact the best you can. We're going to use them later. Slice and chop just a little cabbage off. Add to the bowl. Chop up the carrot and add to the bowl. Now it's time for the spice. Remember, you can use the spice of your choice. Fennel, caraway, or dill are my recommendations. And here's a tip to enhance the spice flavor. Grind them up. Trust me, this makes a huge beneficial difference. I use a little grinder like this. Fresh grinding causes the explosive flavors and aromas to be released far better than the old oxidized pre-ground spices from the grocery store. Also, fresh grinding releases all those nutrients inside the seed, such as health-boosting polyphenols. Even though I favor fresh ground, if pre-ground is your only option, then use what's available to you. Add to the bowl. Prepare the brine by adding the salt to the water and mix thoroughly. Pour the brine over the vegetables in the bowl and toss to mix, making sure everything is coated with the brine. Allow it to rest for 15 to 20 minutes. While it's resting, we can prepare the jars by washing them in hot soapy water. No need to sterilize, hot soapy water is sufficient. It's now been 15 minutes. The brine has been working on pulling the water from within the vegetables, causing the brine to turn dark green, and the greens are much softer now. This all looks perfect, so let's load the jars. I like to use a canning funnel when loading the jars. Take a couple of handfuls and drop them into the jar. Remember to always have clean washed hands. Then with a fermenting tamper like this, or anything functionally similar, pack down the vegetable mixture. Repeat with another 2 or 3 handfuls. I'll just finish this off like so. I overfilled the jar with too much liquid since the fermentation weight still needs to be added and there's currently no room for that. So an easy result is to scoop some out as I'm doing here. And if you also find yourself in this position, do the same thing. About here is a perfect fill level. Remember that cabbage leaf we set aside from earlier? Tear a couple pieces of it to fit over the vegetable mixture. If you didn't use cabbage, then don't worry about it so long as you use a fermentation weight. It will be okay. I like to use cabbage toppers like this because in addition to the fermentation weight we're going to add, they really help keep everything fully submerged beneath the brine. And that's how the food remains safe during fermentation, by staying submerged beneath the brine. I'll explain a little more in a moment on how brine acts as a protectant. These are the glass fermenting weights I prefer using and recommend. Place it into the jar like this and press it down. I'm using a plate underneath to catch any overflow. And while I'm here, I'm going to remove these little floaters that popped up. This is important to do because anything that comes in contact with the surface oxygen above the brine, like these floaters, runs the risk of molding. This is how it should look. Perfect. Place a loose lid on the jar and allow it to sit on the counter at room temperature for 14 to 21 days. But we're not done. The fermentation process has only just begun, and there's a lot of action that's going to take place inside that jar, especially during the first week. I'm now going to take you through what is going to happen next, what to watch for, how to know if the fermentation took hold or not, and how to end the fermentation and store it for long term. This is a lot of information, but it's going to help you become a successful and safe fermenter. Within the first 24 to 72 hours, you'll notice that the brine will become cloudy and the colors will become muted. This is normal and to be expected. Bubbles will also begin to form within the first 24 to 72 hours. The bubbles are a result of CO2 gases forming due to the fermentation kicking into gear. These gases are why using a fermentation weight is so important. The CO2 will push the vegetables up, and any food that rises above the brine is now exposed to oxygen, creating a perfect environment for mold. So even if everything is packed down tight on day 1, by day 3, that tight pack is going to be loosened by the saltwater brine, and the CO2 gases will easily push everything up. So don't skip the weight. It's important. This is the fermentation at 72 hours. As you can see, the brine overflowed because the CO2 gases are pushing everything up. Some new floaters have been pushed up, and I'm going to remove them so that they don't cause any potential mold issues later. Let's find out if the fermentation is taking sound hold or not. First and foremost, I'm going to smell the fermentation. A healthy fermentation has a light, soury sweet smell caused by the good probiotic bacteria proliferating. A fermentation that has gone bad will have a foul odor caused by bad bacteria, not the good ones. A musty smell also indicates that the fermentation has failed or is in the process of failing. If it passes the smell test, then you can next take a pH reading for good measure, which will help build your confidence by seeing actual numbers. What does pH have to do with a healthy fermentation? Here's how. Vegetable fermentation is a type of fermentation called lactofermentation. The probiotics responsible for a successful lactofermentation are from a genus of bacteria called Lactobacillus. The lactobacillus feed on the natural sugars in the food and release lactic acid as a byproduct. It's the release of that lactic acid that causes the pH of a vegetable fermentation to drop below 4.5 on the pH scale. Bad bacteria cannot survive in a pH below 4.5, whereas the good probiotic bacteria can. In addition to the brine being acidic, the brine is also salty and oxygen-free. The good probiotic bacteria are anaerobic, meaning they don't need oxygen to survive, whereas the bad bacteria are the opposite, and they do need oxygen. So in an oxygen-free environment, the bad bacteria die off. Salt is also antimicrobial, at least to the bad pathogens. The good bacteria are salt tolerant, so the brine being a combination of lactic acid, salt, and no oxygen is what makes vegetable fermentation done right safe. If a fermentation is not taking hold, that means that the good lactobacillus bacteria are not proliferating and therefore not releasing lactic acid into the brine. As a result, the pH of the brine will remain above 4.5 and ultimately begin to stink and spoil with age. For the purpose of comparing before and after, here's the pH of a kale I just prepared. The pH is above 4.5 because it's day 0 and no fermentation has yet taken place. Now this is the same kale 3 days later. The pH has dropped to 3.5. A pH below 4.5 is what I call the safety zone. This low pH in the safety zone tells me that the fermentation has successfully taken hold based on what I just explained about the good bacteria and lactic acid. Sometimes the pH drop doesn't happen as quickly as 3 days, but give it until day 5. If the pH has not dropped below 4.5 by the end of day 5, it's not going to. If you smell it, it probably already smells off rather than soury sweet like a healthy fermentation should. If this happens, throw it away or compost it. If you're interested in a pH meter, I provide a link in the description, and be sure to watch my video on how to calibrate and use it properly. This is day 7 and Kahm yeast has developed on the surface. Kahm yeast is the general name given to a variety of harmless yeasts naturally present in the air around us. Just leave it be, since it will just come back the next day if it's removed at this point. But don't worry, I'll show you how to remove it at the end of the fermentation period when it's time for long-term storage. You can learn more about Kahm yeast in my Fermentation Funk series. P.S. If you feel the need to take a pH reading after Kahm yeast has developed, the meter can go right through it and simply rinse the meter off afterwards. No problem. Now that I know the pH has dropped into the safety zone, I will let the fermentation just do its thing for the next couple of weeks without disturbing it too much. I'll check in every 4 or 5 days with a quick smell check. If it smells soury sweet, then it's passed the smell test. And then for a visual test, other than Kahm yeast, if I see no other surface funk developing, such as mold or weird colors, then I will continue to leave it alone, put the lid back on, and let it continue fermenting. Fast forward, I'm now going to end the fermentation. The fermentation on the left is a Swiss chard version at day 16, and on the right is a kale at day 21. Both have Kahm yeast. The Swiss chard's Kahm yeast is a little lighter than the kale's, giving a different appearance, but different appearances of Kahm yeast is no big deal. Before I remove it, with clean hands, I will first reach in and remove the weight, since the weight will lift the bulk of the Kahm yeast out with it. Use a clean paper towel to wipe the inside of the jar. Then just dab the surface a bit to collect some of the bits and pieces remaining. A few specks left behind are just fine. Remove the cabbage leaf topper if you used one. I did on the kale, but not on the Swiss chard for demonstration purposes. This is good to eat, by the way, so no need to toss it. Now, take a taste test with a clean fork, of course, never double dipping. Lastly, before placing these in the refrigerator, I'll confirm the pH. Both have a perfect pH below 4.5, and actually the pH is in the sweet spot between 3 and 4. For storage, place the lid tightly back on the jar. If you plan to store the kale or Swiss chard for a while before eating it on a regular basis, you can just put the cabbage topper leaf back on. It will help be a protectant during the storage in the refrigerator. No worries if you didn't use one, and if planning to eat regularly right away, then you can just eat the cabbage topper too. For long-term storage, keep in the refrigerator where it will last for many months. Do not store long-term in any environment above 45 degrees. One year I made several jars of fermented kale and ended up storing it for 9 months before I got around to eating it, since I just had so many other fermentations I was working on. I think it even tasted better with age. So if stored properly, it will keep in the refrigerator for quite a long time. Lastly, I promised I would show you some fermentation fails. The demonstrations will be with kale, but Swiss chard also applies. Here's a visual demonstration on how to tell if the fermentation has gone bad. This is a store-bought kale on day 5 with no added vegetables. Smell-wise, it has a foul stench. Visually, it has weird growths on top that are not normal bubbles. And pH-wise, it's well above 4.5. This is a fermentation fail. This is a garden kale on day 5 that also has no added vegetables. Smell-wise, it doesn't have a foul stench, but rather it has a light musty odor. Visually, the bubbles are not as funky looking, but since the smell tipped me off that things aren't right, the pH meter will tell the final tale. It's well above 4.5, so this too is a fermentation fail. This is a store-bought kale where I did add other vegetables to it. It started off okay, the smell was soury sweet, and the pH dropped from 7.2 on day 0 to 3.8 by day 3. Because of these positive signs, I allowed it to continue without further interruption. When I opened it again on day 20, visually it looked okay with normal Kahm yeast, but smell-wise, it had changed from a light soury sweet smell to musty. It wasn't foul, but just musty. This was my first cue that something wasn't right. A pH reading confirms this is not good since it's above 4.5. So although the store kale started okay with added vegetables, it ended as a fail. I confirm my advice, don't use store-bought. It won't end successfully like the garden kale and Swiss chard will, providing of course that you add other vegetables to help it. This was a mega video, so if you are still here with me, then I'm impressed. You're a diehard who really wants to learn. Take your learning further by checking out my complete playlist of fermentation recipes and education. The recipes are delicious and the education videos will help make you a more confident and competent fermenter, along with the willingness to try. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.